Good morning. As the most popular ride in all Disney theme parks goes, it is a small world after all. I hope we all agree that governance of global health has to be rooted in universal recognition of the reality that we live in an interconnected and interdependent world, as Dr. Mahbubani said, in one single big ship. Or, as Martin Luther King said, we are enmeshed in an inescapable network of mutuality. COVID-19 pandemic has underscored this reality and served notice that global health must revise its ethos and reform the edifice of its governance. Also, as the climate change clock ticks at a frenetic pace, we have a race against time to protect global health. Global health has evolved thus far more from enlightened self-interest than from ennobling altruism. In the post-colonial world of the second half of the 20th century, international health transformed itself into global health. This drew impetus from a sense of shared vulnerability to pandemic threats and bioterrorism. Will it now gain momentum from shared values rather than just shared vulnerability? Shared values of commitment to creation of healthy societies everywhere in the world. That requires all countries to be inspired by the spirit of solidarity. It also calls for commitment to primary care-led universal health coverage and unified action on the social, economic, environmental, and commercial determinants of health. Are we there? If not, how can we get there? Let's first look at the many actors, the ensemble of actors who are now shaping global health governance. Let's consider the countries first. High-income countries have overwhelmingly paid attention to infectious diseases from colonial times through to the recent discussions on the revision of international health regulations and the new pandemic treaty, which are both being negotiated under the auspices of the WHO, because they were worried about infections coming in from other parts of the world into their territories. Even the current definition of health security by the World Health Organization talks of acute public health events. Surely, non-communicable diseases, climate change, and conflict, and the widening economic inequities which impact upon the health of the whole world are not acute events. Will the WHO revise its definition of health security? Are high-income countries shy of addressing these issues because of their political and commercial interests are to be protected? Low and middle-income countries have so far not had much impact on global health governance. Will the emerging economies among them be able to change the script by using their rising GDPs and market access as levers of influence? Will organizations like AMREF in Africa make development partners pay more attention, more respectful attention to the priorities set by countries and deal directly with them? Who else holds the purse strings apart from high-income countries? Multilateral development banks play a major role in financing countries. Till recently, they too have echoed the priorities for global health set by high-income countries. Will they now become more responsive to the priorities set by the countries themselves in the low and middle-income world? Is their commitment to position health in the climate change agenda likely to lead to policy consensus, first among them and then leading to concerted actions with the countries? Private foundations have acquired enormous power in shaping global health priorities and directing national health programs. While welcoming their positive contributions, can global health governance prevent their capture of international bodies and national policies? Multilateral agencies have emerged in the MDG era to bring together governments, private philanthropy, and multilateral development banks to give a global thrust to counter global threats. In the SDG era, are they supplementing or are they supplanting WHO and the UN agencies? The private sector wants a seat at the table when policies are made, both at national and global levels. While some sections of the private sector may recognize the economic dividend of protecting the health of populations everywhere, powerful sections of the industry relentlessly maneuver to delay, dilute, or derail public health laws and regulatory measures which are needed to protect people's health. Will the world unite to combat and curb the menace of tobacco, ultra-processed foods, sugar-sweetened beverages, fossil fuels, and other pollutants? Leave aside the commercial drivers of NCDs. Even in a devastating pandemic, proprietary science and patent protection for profit maximization were prioritized over public good. Who will ensure that the benefits of digital health, for example, now are not held hostage to big tech or to digital nationalism? The World Trade Organization could not agree on the proposal from South Africa and India for patent waivers for vaccines, drugs, and diagnostics, even though the podium refrain was that no country is safe till every country is safe. The battles fought by Thailand on compulsory licensing are a reminder that trade rules do not always favor global health. What about the neutral arbiters and conscience keepers of global health policy, like WHO and UN agencies? Can we depend upon them to provide the moral compass for a complex and complicated world? When they are financially constrained, buffeted by big power politics, and have other influential actors crowding them out on the podium of global policy. Surely the civil society is an important actor too. As Thailand has shown, the triangle that moves the mountain must unify governments, academia, and the civil society if we have to bring in change. Even as we debate whether all of these existing actors are fit for purpose in revitalizing global health governance, we are staring at a scenario where global financing for health is unable to rise to the required levels because of competing priorities like from conflict to climate change, climate emergencies. How then can we invigorate global health with the spirit of solidarity and propel it on the mission of enshrining and extending the healthy life expectancy for all populations on Earth, not just life expectancy, but healthy life expectancy? How do we create healthy societies where disease and disability, denied health care do not shorten lives, and where disability does not erode productivity and well-being, and where the elderly are not frail or feeble, but fit and functioning? To explore the potential pathway for that journey, we have three experts today. We have, firstly, Ms. Precious Matsoso, who is Director of the Health Regulatory Science Platform at the Witwatersrand University in Africa, and co-chair of the International Negotiating Body of the Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness, and Response Treaty that's being negotiated at WHO. We have Dr. Bruce Gellin, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief of Global Public Health Strategy at the Rockefeller Foundation, and we have Dr. Gitanji Gitahi, who is the Global CEO of AMREF Health Africa and a former co-chair of UHC 2030 Steering Committee. And to coordinate and lead the discussion, we have also now Dr. Mishal Khan, who is a professor of health policy and systems at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Over to you, Mishal.
Thank you, Professor Reddy, for those Great opening comments. And I think this session follows on very nicely from the previous discussion. I'd like to think I'm an optimistic person, but whenever I'm now reflecting on what happened again during the pandemic and seeing what's happening at the moment in the Middle East, it is difficult to be optimistic. So instead, I'm going to at least be forward-looking in the questioning and use the opportunity of having so many experts in the room and on the panel here to think about how we might like things to change, identify some perhaps concrete things that we would like to see. That's not sufficient, but it is necessary, and having some of the civil society colleagues here does inspire that idea of let's at least think about how we would like things to be different. So maybe we'll start my first question to Precious, given that we have been talking about pandemics and using that as an opportunity to reflect on the lack of accountability, the lack of sharing, even sharing of credit when countries had expertise, that too was lacking. So how might we reconfigure things and have what would we want to see differently, and how might we get there from your angle?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the Prince Mahitol Award Conference for inviting me. You know, you are saying you are not optimistic. I must say I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist because, you know, in South Africa, when AIDS was ravaging and there was no access, there was no hope at the time that people would be put on treatment. And I think there were multiple problems. On one hand, the denialism on the part of government. On the other, the court action by the pharmaceutical industry. So those two colliding problems did not deter us from responding. But the geopolitical environment at the time helped us because civil society had solidarity, not only in South Africa but elsewhere, but we also had support of other players. And I see that opportunity now. But I must say that with the global health governance, we probably need to do better, because over the years we've been reforming. And I'm saying we probably need to move from reform to transform. And I try to look at what would be different. When we reform, we improve, we amend by change or fault, we introduce better methods or course, but transform means we change completely. So reforming the emergency program was probably the right step. It was a right step, but also it did not help us transform. Now is opportune. I was looking at the poly crisis, and it reminded me of what the Global Health Watch had published a couple of years ago about the multiple crises, the F crisis, financial, fuel, and food crisis. And I see these Fs have expanded beyond to include famine, to include floods, to include uncontrollable fires, because environmental disasters. So as we respond, we probably need to have that transformative change that take into account the changed environment that has multiple actors, that also has multiple institutions. Of course, multiple institutions, actors introduce fragmentation, and it cannot be business as usual. So the pandemic accord discussions present an opportunity to bring about that transformation. However, it should be about process and content. process and content that involves multiple players. Governments alone cannot do it. We've seen with the COVID disaster that it was not just government that was affected, it was also multiple players, communities. So when we create structures to govern better in future, at a national level, we must start at community level and engage from that level. In fact, even with these discussions that are ongoing for the pandemic accord, they should have started at community level in governments so that people should understand better whether their lives will change in future and whether they'll be better prepared and whether there'll be fairness. And at regional level, we need to see much more configuration of how these regional structures interact with the global ones. Globally, our governance need to transform. Like I said, we have reformed. So the question is, should it be COP, the Conference of Parties, as a new governance arrangement? Should it be the transformed or reformed World Health Assembly with Committee E? Or do we need a Global Health Risk Council? I leave that question to you because at the moment, we cannot even agree on the most fundamental issue of equity. Equity by ensuring access and benefit sharing. Now, if we can't even move from that, I can't even imagine whether we'll agree on governance. And I'm hopeful, though, that this will happen, and in May we will have a pandemic agreement.
Thank you. So I will bring in the others, but perhaps just in the interest of time, want to switch to financing and have a question to you, Bruce, about that. The current sort of mechanisms for financing, are they fit for purpose when we think about equity, accountability, and if not, then how might they change to better move in the direction that Precious has just pointed out?
So, is this on?
Should be on, but let me give you mine.
So Jesse teed this up a little bit, asking in the earlier session about where the money goes. So I think that's in the background here. And while this is a session about governance and health, it's clear that it's going to take organization, it's going to take leadership, it's going to take values, it's going to take partnership, but it's also going to take money. So we're going to have to see to make sure that there is the right money in the system. Fortunately, we have people from the international financial world in the audience, so hopefully they'll be able to contribute. But maybe in the spirit of PMAC that is built on mega trends, not future trends, but trends that are already happening, maybe it's worth thinking through some of those trends that are already moving. Here's a quiz question for you. Don't do any math, but just in your mind, how many years has it been since Bretton Woods? So I've done this, so don't do the math, but just what you think. So when you ask people, they tell you, well, 30, 40, 50, but nobody tells you 80, that it's been 80 years. And so to think through how much has changed in 80 years. The G7 came about because of an oil crisis, the G20 because of an Asian financial crisis. And so I think we're seeing this sort of realignment and rearrangement of some of the voices. In the climate world, now there's the V20, which actually is 68 countries, which is the vulnerable countries. So I think we're starting to see how some of these things are coming about, and a number of ideas that come forward. Prime Minister Mato of Barbados talks about that with the Bridgetown Accord, and I think what that calls for is taking a hard look at the problem, about the problem of debt that you can't get out of and problem of money you can't get access to. So I think that there's more attention to that. And when I think about that V20, I think it's maybe the vulnerable, but it's also the voices. So we're starting to see some of those changes. In the climate sphere, which is we're not done with the pandemic, but we have yet another existential crisis, that's another area where we're going to need to figure this out. COP28 tells us that this is the 28th year that we've been talking about it, and only this year was there a health day. We're all celebrating that, but it took almost 30 years to get a day, and there was more to it. There's a declaration, there are some commitments, so accountability is going to be a key here. But I think that's another point of trying to think through how we're going to make sure that the financial system is fit for purpose. As you say, not only can we grow the pie so there's more available to take on some of these problems, but also to make it an easier system to access, because there's financing that's available that's difficult to come by. Just in a second, the Rockefeller Foundation, with a number of different partners, has been talking about this. And Precious, to your point about fragmentation, there's a lot of people now getting into this space, and each has their own rules and their own applications. So there's been now an effort by many, and now over 50 organizations have signed on to this, to try to have guiding principles, so that people will have their own rules, but there's a set of principles so you can see they're all after the same thing. Equity is at the top of the list. They want to make sure access is there. It wants to inspire innovation and grow the pot. So I think that there's hope, so I'm also an optimist, and there's been enough traction towards this that is finally getting attention. But remember, it's COP28, and it took 28 years to get here. There is a saying, and it's one of these sayings that's supposed to be said by everybody, the Chinese proverb, African proverb, the best time to have planted a tree was 20 years ago, but if not, then today. So I think that tells us we need to go forward. And just one final comment. We talked a lot about elephants. An elephant not in the room is the private sector. And at least there are discussions, and I think this is where accountability needs to come in, of what they refer to as their triple bottom line for the environment, for safety and security, and for their profits. So how those get balanced is a shift from what's called shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. It may be just words, but at least it's an opportunity to bring that sector in. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And clearly, thinking about the reform versus transform, there's something about the depth of the changes, and there's something about the speed as well that's really important. I would hopefully, and the audience will support in this, is come back to the issue of accountability as well, and who's holding the financiers to account for the decisions that they're making, and evaluating what has been successful and what's not. So perhaps we can come back to that. But Ketinji, a big question to you, again, keeping it forward-looking. If you could, how would you reconfigure the way that the global governance actors are currently set up? And I'll ask all the other panelists to come in on this as well, but some of these, what concrete changes would you like to see?
It's a difficult question, because we've thought about the global health system, the architecture of the global health governance for long, but nobody seems to have a solution for it. I think to reflect on the question you're asking, and also the conversation that was there before and what have been said here by my colleagues, first is to tell peace, I hope you end up with a good pandemic treaty. But again, hope is not a strategy, so I hope that we can do something to make sure that it actually happens. I'll share some of my thoughts right now. The first question, Michelle, is to ask, what is it that we want to govern in global health? Because governance, you need to establish what is it you're governing. In limited companies, they're governing assets and capital, and therefore they put a board to govern those assets. And there's some rules around that. In global health, we are not very sure what we are governing. I think that's where the problem starts, because there's no global health system that exists. There are national health systems that result in the health of populations globally. But there are many actors in this health system, and that's what we kind of tend to see. How do we govern these multiple actors? And it's actually a mishmash of government, state, non-state, trade, travel, WTO, NGOs, religious leaders. It's actually a very complex construct. And therefore, the first question would be, what exactly do we want this construct to govern? Sometimes we tend to think that global health governance should govern national systems. It shouldn't, and I think that was said earlier. National systems are governed by their communities, by the people who are in that country. And they set up those governance, some work, some don't, but there are mechanisms of that managing the national health system. Global governance, from my view, should focus on certain principles around governing global goods for health, for example. global public goods for health. And I think that's where we have seen failure. When you look at, for example, intellectual property that was talked about earlier and all these, the global health goods, COVAX was a global health good. How did we manage that? How did we govern it, as we were saying earlier? So that's one. The second thing is governing externalities, things like climate change and the impact on health, where they are actually beyond one country. The other area I would like to say is about solidarity of resources. Organized development aid, and resources are not just money, it's knowledge, benefit sharing that we are discussing here. Pandemic treaty is a global public good. How do we govern the pandemic treaty? So that is the other role that we need to put on global governance. And finally, the stewardship of all these things. If we look at it that way, then we start to ask, who are the actors of this governance? It's all of us. And I think that the challenge we found within global health governance is that, and I think I picked up from what Professor Agnes Miragoho was saying, is that global health has no rules. It's not a rules-based system. It's neither a rules-based governance system, neither is it a rights-based governance system. We think rights are the center, but they're not. And there's no hierarchy. It's kind of just a big mess. If you look at other areas where there is global governance, the areas around, for example, tax systems, areas like in civil and political rights, you find actually there are governance structures. Recently South Africa went to the International Court to say that there should be a cessation of animosity and in the Middle East. Now, I don't see such rules around global health. It's almost like it's norms. It's like, these are good practices. If you like them, please go ahead. And maybe this is our challenge, because the source of this is the dichotomy of rights, that there's some rights that are absolute. Like, if my country refuses me to vote, that's an absolute right that has been denied. But if my country denies my mother a right to health, it's progressive. It may or may not. I have not seen another country attack another because there's no health system. But I've seen a country attack another because there is no democracy. So the question is, out of these constructs, then we need to say we need to probably move towards a rights-based and rules-based governance framework. And we have seen successes in the Tobacco Convention. There was a kind of a rules-based governance there. We've seen in the international health regulations, there are some, though now we are strengthening it, and I wish peace all the best with that. But I haven't seen this rules-based approach applied much in global health. So I think that is one of the areas that we would want to focus on. But the challenge, as we've seen with WHO during COVID-19, is that the people who even govern some of these, the governance of these global health initiatives is behind the tent, is behind the room. It is those who open their checkbooks that determine what goes on in the boardroom. It is those who want us to believe and want us to direct our anger at COVAX because they want us to direct the anger away from them because they're the ones who failed. Those are the people that we need to ask ourselves, how do we actually handle the movement of powerful nations and capitalism to ensure that we actually achieve rules-based governance within global health? And one of the things that I think we can do is use our voting power. Because I think if I look at my continent in Africa, it is a continent with the most countries, 54 countries. If that continent of Africa could get together behind benefit sharing or the pandemic treaty, as a continent and say, we stand on a common Africa position, and then maybe get Asia, get South America and say, let us stand on a common position. And we will go and cast our vote based on equity that we want and need. If we do that, then I think we have a better success at governance, because the only other thing that's more powerful than money is votes, actually. So I think that's what I would like to say. But finally, I want us to talk about an initiative which has been going on, which is reforming the narrow view of the future of global health initiatives. The narrow view, it's not global health governance, but they are global health initiatives like Gavi, COVAX, Global Fund, and now the Pandemic Fund, and all those that actually are part of this governance. And there's a demand and a request, actually I would say a demand for them to be more country-specific and to be country-led. But that will not happen unless the countries that demand the equity make themselves stronger through getting together, joining together to impact the governance so that the governance reform is bottom-up, not top-down.
Thank you. A lot of food for thought there, and some of what you were saying about what to govern, and even what are the shared values in global health. So in Pakistan, where I'm from, we have this idea of, as a family, if you disagree with something, you don't necessarily speak about it outside. So let's think of ourselves as a global health family here, and take a chance to think about whether we think that our home and our family is functioning as it should, because there's something about the explicit and the implicit functioning of global health, and the implicit function around reinforcing existing power. If we look inwards and accept that that is continuing to happen, then that gives us a starting point of wanting to change. So I think that's something to reflect on. I wanted to perhaps bring in our chair for a round of kind of comments or reflections, particularly perhaps on the role of civil society. So you talked, Gitanji talked about votes and some of the mechanisms and some of the optimism that we might have. What about the role of civil society in driving some of the changes that we'd like to see?
I think the civil society is absolutely a very important player, not usually recognized or even consulted by governments, and also not consulted by other global stakeholders to the extent they should. But we are increasingly seeing those voices being heard at various fora. For example, even the country coordinating mechanism of HIV/AIDS and so on. But to, again, pick up from Gitanji's comment, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control was developed essentially because of a global public health movement led by civil society. The academia contributed by creating the knowledge base, especially when we learned about secondhand smoke hurting other people, and that created outrage. Then we had the tobacco industry documents spilling out into the open. But it was the sense of outrage that was actually created as a popular perception by the civil society across the world that created a global public health movement. Even before, as I was telling yesterday, that basically, even before Bloomberg and the Gates Foundation came in with their tobacco control support grants in 2005, the FCTC was already there in 2003. And that was essentially because of the civil society-led movement. Now, the campaign against breast milk substitutes, the campaign now against ultra-processed foods, all of these are important elements. But I think it is very important for us also to recognize, as Gitanji said, we also need to look at health equity at the national level. When we are demanding health equity at the global level, it is invidious if we do not ensure that the battles for health equity within countries also advance. And that is where the civil society can play a tremendous role. Because if you are denied health equity within your own countries, then it's difficult to recognize the importance of health equity at the global level. So these must actually converge and create the climate for global health equity.
Yeah, fantastic point. Bruce or Precious, would you like to add anything before I open it to the audience on some of the changes that you would like to see in the system?
Well, maybe in addition, I could say perhaps, I mean, we talk about whole of society and whole of government approaches. Practically, what does that mean? And maybe we can learn from the Thai experience of the health, the fora that have been established and other formations elsewhere. But what I think will be important for the pandemic accord, if you read the articles, there are multiple areas that are multi-layered on sub-governance structures. But the question is, when we conclude this work, it must be integrated. We don't need a complex governance regime that will just add to the fragmentation. And as the negotiations proceed, we want civil society and experts in the room. And I think there's a lot of resistance. We understand policy making is the mandate of government and is the competence of government. But policy making should also bring in other actors to enrich discussions, but also help us to steer this in the right direction.
If I go back, I want to highlight another point of Katinji's. You talked about communities, you talked about global, but you mentioned regional once. And it seems to me that there's a rise in regional power that might be another, it's not either or, but another, the voice will become increasingly important. You know that's going on in Africa, other regions are doing it. How do you see the growth of regional power fitting into the system?
Well, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. If you look, there's been a lot of movement in Europe, in Africa. There's a public health order that has been agreed to. So we need to bring about alignment in those regional efforts. I think in my initial inputs, I said we need to ensure that the governance at a global level incorporate players from these regional structures. But as to how the configuration should be is going to be extremely important.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, Bruce, because one of the points that I wanted to add here is the issue of interests and back to the question of what we are governing, because many of us seated here and who go for global health conferences don't realize that global health is actually rotating around global health security. Actually, global health and global health security are almost interchangeable, because when you talk about global health, the resources that we see into Gavi, the resources we see into Ebola, the resources we see into COVID, were all driven by trade and travel interests. And therefore, even the global health we're talking about is easily interchangeable with just global health security. So the interests behind the governance are self-interests of countries that are funding global health. But where will the interests of those who are not funding global health as we know it going to be reflected? They're going to be reflected in the regional bodies, because it is the Africa CDC and PAHO and WAHO that are going to sit down and say, hey, we have a big problem with non-communicable diseases. We are losing 700,000 people to cancer every year, but is there going to be a global health mechanism to manage that? No interest, because they are not an infectious disease. We are seeing that in the next few years, the death from cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, and others are going to actually outpace infectious diseases. But is there a global health mechanism to manage non-communicable diseases? The answer is no, because they don't affect the funding countries, because they are not infectious to them. So these regional bodies are going to shift the interest for our global health governance by starting to look locally, nationally, and regionally, and addressing issues together. And that's why we're talking about the rules-based approach, because if Africa, for example, decides that non-communicable diseases are an important thing to address, they're not going to wait for Gavi Global Fund and the global system to address it. They'll get together and set rules for food and beverages that are responsive to their people, and planning of cities that are responsive to their people. So I think the regional piece in this is really critically important.
Yeah, and I think it's a bitter pill to swallow, but the recognition that much of this is driven by interests rather than a drive for solidarity and equity. It's not nice to accept that, but perhaps it's the reality, and if we begin to be a bit more comfortable accepting that, we can have a more realistic discussion. So I wonder now if we have some comments or questions from the audience. Hi, Renzo, nice to see you.
And nice to see you, Michelle, and to the panel. Renzo Guito from the Philippines. First and foremost, I laud the panel for emphasizing the importance of civil society in global governance for health. Unfortunately, we know that in PMAC this year, We're missing the people's health movement. And as you said, Michal, we are a global health family. Most families can fix their problems internally. I'm sure we can bring back the PHM in future PMACs. So that's my first contribution. And second, which is part question, part comment, last week, actually, the University of Oslo Lancet Commission on Global Governance for Health commemorated its 10th year anniversary. And in that convening, there was a question, what was the impact of that commission in terms of improving global governance for health? And the panel was quite, unsure even, in terms of the impact. And, there have been many commissions, reports about how to address the chronic global governance challenges that we're facing in the health sector and beyond. And it seems that, we're not successful in addressing these, especially as more of these challenges are emerging, polycrisis, et cetera. So my question is, how can we, I guess one main thing that we're missing here is how can we rebuild the trust that has been broken along different dimensions, trust between governments and people, trust between private and public sector, trust between sectors. Now the health sector and the climate sector are starting to engage. How can we, use the evidence that we know in order to rebuild the trust to enhance global governance for health? Thank you very much.
Thanks. I might take a second question here and then pass it over to the audience, to the panel.
Thank you very much, moderator. This is Renmin Hui from Peking University, China. Thank you very much for the excellent comments and the insight shared from the panels. I have a probably question and observations. Since we're talking about global health governance, I think probably, as some people said in the panel, there's close association linkage between global health governance with national health governance. We hear so much great commitment made in many political declarations, as we hear last year in the UN about the pandemic treaty, and also member states engaged intensively about the new HR's revision and the pandemic treaty. But my question, observation is, how exactly we can make all this political commitment be accountable by the country? And I'm probably just question from maybe interest to all of the audience here. How many countries really increase the national budget to strengthen their health systems after pandemic? How many countries really increase their investment on workforce and strengthen the disease surveillance? How many countries really take the accurate actions in terms of new regulations, strengthen their health laws in the country to prepare the pandemics next time? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So perhaps the first question on rebuilding trust, would anyone like to take that, Githinji, please? Okay, Bruce Githinji, yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to comment laterally. Yes. So the U.S. perspective, the Global Security Index was supposed to be a measurement of country readiness for a pandemic. The U.S. ranked first in that index, and you saw how we did. When you looked at it again, probably the core thing that was missing was trust in the system was part of our downfall. So again, it's not an answer to your question, but it highlights the importance of trust as an underpinning of all the other things you're looking at.
Thanks. Vinci.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it's unfortunate that trust is difficult to rebuild, because especially using the triangle of logic, empathy, and authenticity. And if you look at the logic we just talked about the logic for global governance and all the challenges we are having is national interest. It's not global interest. So already the logic is warped. And we talked about that in the earlier session, that actually the interest for these things is national interest, is what is actually starting up. The second thing is that people don't trust each other because people don't think they're acting in their interest, back to those interests. So I think that the best way to build trust is to make sure there's a level playing field. Then people know that whatever you mean, there's a rule. So back to the rules-based governance, because you may have a different interest, but the rule is equitable. And that's why it's really critical that we get the Pandemic Accord right and we get the IHR and implementation and accountability right. Because until the rules are level, you cannot have trust.
Well, we have generally been dealing with a vicious cycle where the governments don't trust NGOs, NGOs don't trust the private sector doesn't trust the government. What we need is now a virtuous cycle where everybody trusts each other, but acts with responsibility. So even the word PPP, which is defined as a public-private partnership, should be redefined as a partnership for a public purpose. A public purpose which is clearly defined, deliverables are very clearly listed, and accountability mechanisms are also clearly affixed. And once we do that and put public interest front and center, then it's easier to create trust. And that becomes an important element. One of the players, unfortunately, that we have not discussed is the media. Gitinji said that votes matter more than money, but money can buy the media and influence the voting as well. So we have to try and utilize all the levers at our disposal in order to put public interest centrally and build partnerships around that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Just to add my weight, I think trust is end also. We probably will have to look at how that's end in the nature in which we establish partnerships, whether partnerships at a strategic level, at a technical level, at an operational level. At an operational level is trust that's built between those who render services and those who are recipients and beneficiaries. So these cannot just be imposed on them, they should be consulted, they must be part of the solution. At a technical level, when results of studies are shared, they should build trust between communities and scientists, trust between academics and those who use knowledge. At a strategic level, it can be trust between governments and the populace, but also governments and non-state actors. And we see that this often does not happen as best as possible. Thank you.
Precious, while you have the mic, could I also ask you to just comment on the second question about national governments investing in light, for pandemics and preparedness and your reflections of their role in kind of building towards a better system?
Well, what you've seen, I mean, one of the issues that was raised was, whether universal health coverage should be a pillar to how we respond to pandemics, so that investments should not just be about following a disease. We've seen over the years that a lot of money went into HIV and AIDS and other programs and moved towards non-communicable diseases. But of course, at the risk of strengthening health systems. And now, during this recovery phase, we're seeing again these structural changes and very, very tight budgetary budget constraints, and we're worried that it's actually going to reverse the gains that we've seen during COVID, where there were some investments, and all of that are being reversed. So I'm of the view that the difference with the South African system is that we've always invested in our response, our HIV/AIDS response, COVID and so on. But the inefficiencies, and of course we've always said, do we still throw money into a system that's inefficient? So I think it's both. You need efficient systems, but you also need to inject resources to make that system perform better. So at the moment, these budgetary cuts are not going to be helpful. But I think the, the key message here is that we must all move towards investing in universal health coverage for sustainability.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I can comment quickly, and a good example is the increase in financing and capacity of national public health institutes in Africa.
Yeah.
Before COVID-19, not many countries had actually rules gazetted for establishing national public health institutes and allocating resources for them. But now we have many African countries, including the strengthening of the regional coordinating mechanisms, laboratory molecular capacity, which has grown significantly. So I would say yes, that many governments have actually invested in capacity for disease surveillance and control.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that was striking that I think could have been done better is just the way the debt was restructured in light of the pandemic and how some countries, so that to me is another failure of the solidarity, and even I think it's very short-sighted even when thinking about self-interest, because kind of penalizing countries that are investing in their health systems by having their debt mount up is really going to backfire. But perhaps then I will, there's at least 3 more questions, and I'd love to be able to cover them all, so I'll turn it over. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Soumya Swaminathan.
There will be 4.
4, okay, absolutely. We'll take them. Please go ahead.
Yeah, Soumya Swaminathan from India, so formerly chief scientist at the World Health Organization. I wanted to make 2 points. The first one is about the determinants of health, and I think these have been referred to as we see the rise of non-communicable diseases. Many of these determinants are either social, economic, environmental, and more importantly, commercial. And so I think a lot of what determines our health is outside actually our health system. And so when we talk about universal health coverage, most of us are focusing on the health system, and a lot of the global discourse today is about infectious diseases, whereas the major toll of disease is going to be from the impacts of climate change and from the impacts of unfair trade practices in agriculture and food policy, for example, that's pushing a lot of unhealthy foods onto the poorer countries who don't have the ability to negotiate. And so the World Trade Organization really needs to look at public health outcomes as part of the trade negotiations. I know that when India and South Africa went to them, during COVID and moved for the lifting of intellectual property restrictions, that actually failed, but that actually is a reason for similar discussions as are happening at the World Health Assembly to happen at the World Trade Organization's Assembly to see what they should do, especially when there are these big global public health emergencies and technologies that could be available to solve the problem but not fairly accessible. My second point is about the new model of R&D and innovation that's needed. The traditional model, especially in the high-income countries, is where the US, for example, puts $40 billion of research funding through just the NIH alone. And all the intellectual property that's created is then handed over to the private sector to price at whatever price they want, with the result that even people in the US don't have access to those health products, which, including things like insulin. So we need a different model of R&D where, especially if taxpayer money is going to be used to fund research, and this should be across all countries, high income, middle income, and hopefully low income countries also start investing more in research. The outcome, fruits of that research, so then there should be conditionalities imposed on the private sector so that they are broadly accessible to domestic populations and then, of course, to international populations. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, those kind of forward-looking statements are fantastic, yes. Yeah, I'll take a couple more, please.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Albert Domingo, Assistant Secretary, Department of Health, Philippines. I just wanted to give some thoughts and also ask the panel for their inputs. How can we have a global governance mechanism that is accountable, enforceable, or binding, and agile? I say those 3 points because when we speak of accountability, often the accountability is to the secretariat or the organization which is implementing the governance mechanism. But what about accountability for the member states and their actions, in particular when it comes to health interventions? And how can we make those health interventions, not just recommendations, as is often the language presented to member states. And then we wait for the member states to actually make it law, domestically enforceable. How do you make it binding? And third, how can we make the governance mechanism agile? During the time of the pandemic, the Department of Health, and I'm sure many other ministries of health, were asking for evidence. And I thank the chief scientist for being in the lead before me. But to be honest, there was a lag time. Often we would ask, I'll say it, we would ask the WHO, what's the evidence on this new drug? What's the evidence on this new vaccine? What is the testing strategy to take? And then the WHO representative will say, we don't have it yet. And then we are faced with the media, we are accountable to our own citizens, we are bound by our own laws. But what will make the global governance mechanism accountable, binding, and also agile? Thank you.
Thank you. Another question, please.
Sawadika. Good morning, everyone. I'm Yuko Nagasaka of Results Japan. We talk about the global health governance in this field, but in my opinion, the thing is the wealth disparity in the world. Nowadays, wealthier people more wealthier, but the poor people is more poor. So we need to reconsider the system now. And as Japanese Health Minister Takemi Keizo talk about the UHC finance, he is working on with the WHO and the World Bank. But I think we need to also consider the innovating financing system, including the international solidarity tax. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Maybe I'll just do these two, the two questions, because there was some great comments. And I'll just ask one panelist each to respond so we get through in time. So Precious, if I may ask you on the, given your experience, how to make the more binding some of the rules and more agile, using the WHO example.
Well, I think with the current debates that are underway, it's quite clear there's a certain level of anxiety among some countries about a legally binding instrument. And purely because of their legislative framework. For instance, in the US, if you come up with a treaty or convention that is based on Article 19 of the Constitution, it is likely not to succeed because of Congress. In some other countries, there are elaborate legislative processes that will take forever to have the domestication of the legal instrument. So I agree. I mean, we've had recommendations that WHO constitution and in particular Article 22, in fact Article 23 is the one that provides for recommendations. We've seen over the years the recommendations are the resolutions that are produced on an annual basis. They actually do not have legal force, and there is no mechanism to monitor or review their level of implementation. So the article that maybe, and I think IHR was established under Article 21, which is about regulation. But the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is actually under Article 19. So we can actually have a combination of 19 and 21, which can bring about some level of sort of obligatory provisions. And that may be a way out. So, but the question is, how do we then get countries to account? There's been a debate about compliance that others may just ignore WHO. And in any event, the countries are like the board and WHO secretariat. They're not going to go to their bosses and say comply.
Yes.
So we obviously need probably some reformed governance that can help us to build in some accountability measures and ensure that there's some reviews, periodic update reviews, and those are the current debates, and we're hopeful that we can. Others said, please don't come up with punitive measures, don't come up with sanctions, come up with something better. So perhaps incentives and disincentives may be a way to go. But let's see how things unfold.
Yeah, people really like to vote for themselves to be held more strongly to account. Maybe on the, Bruce, turning to you on the question about financing and wealth disparities being one of the major risk factors here.
So before, I just want to get back to this last question, because it seems that at the heart of what we're talking about is what you call interests or maybe conflicts. And maybe part of the incentive, disincentive is to make clear, just put it out there, to paint it so everyone can see what those are as a starting point, with the behind that is where transparency is important. On the global financial system, hopefully there are people who actually pull the levers that might come to the microphone, but it seems that there's increasing call for action there. The recognition, as we highlighted, about relieving debt, because that's just an endless cycle. The need to open up flexibility so that countries can access funds that are currently available. I think there's a recognition that what was the post-World War II model doesn't fit now. I don't have the right designs for it, but it's clear that the multiple calls for multiple sectors on multiple problems is a time for that part of the world to try to think of what we do now going forward. And again, maybe there's somebody who can represent some of that and tell us what their thinking is.
Thank you. Thank you for waiting. I will take your question now.
Hello, my name is Kritin Shanprapap. I'm from the Faculty of Medicine, Siraj Hospital. So I would like to ask this question, and I'm sorry if it sounds provocative. There's always news of corruption and greed in health ministries around the world, especially during COVID times, regarding funds going missing, et cetera, et cetera. However, there's not many cases of such news happening in the World Health Organization itself, and including its tributary organizations. So my question is this due to underreporting, or is this due to good governance and good guidelines which prevent certain things like this happening in the World Health Organization itself and its tributary organizations? And if so, how so?
Thank you. Is there another question from this side of the room?
Yes, I would like to build on the trust. Because there is a very good study done by Gallup Institute and Wellcome Trust about the trust of citizens to the health sector. And it has been proven that the population, even if you provide the quality care, they will not take it if they don't trust the health sector, of the public health sector. And this trust is linked to the trust they have in the governance, in the security, in the fact that the judiciary system will be honest as much as the police, etc. So we should not focus on health only, because a bad government will make people not taking the care, even if it's the best care. US is a great example for that, for the minorities, for example. But it's not only the US, so many countries.
Thank you. Githinji, did you want to maybe comment anything further on the trust issue there that was those comments bringing you in? I know you had something to say earlier also about the...
No, I think what Professor Binago has said is true, that people don't trust in isolation. And that's why I was talking about the triangle of empathy. Are you empathetic? Are you authentic? Do you have the logic? And that, if I have the logic on a particular issue, but I'm not a trustworthy person and people don't think, then the trust is not, it cannot be built. So it's going to be trust across. And that's why I was saying that the experience of, that we are having with the high-income countries on holding vaccines destroys the trust of the people, even when those countries give us debt. They think that debt is meant for other reasons because there was already lost trust elsewhere. The pushback on benefit sharing creates another trust gap. So even if now there was another partnership that was going to be done, there will be a failure of trust. You know, Prof talked about private sector. The private sector trust is lost because people think they are not trustworthy because they are profiteering. So I think it's a multidimensional, as is being said. We can't build trust in one sector. It's got to be community level, national level, and global level, which is going to be very difficult unless we have rules that people believe are protected. Can you imagine if you want to play soccer and there are no rules, there's no referee? You can't trust anybody because then, you know, you just have to try and hurt every player because you're not sure you'll be protected. So rules-based trust system, I think, is what we need to go for.
I do want to make sure we come to the corruption question as well. We wanted provocative questions, so certainly don't want to have that one left out. So I don't know, Bruce or Precious, if I could ask you to, or did you want to comment on the previous?
I don't know anything about it, so I'm not going to address the corruption problem. But I want to get back to Agnes's point about trust, because it seems to me there are two other elements of that. Competence is a key part of it. That if people don't think if they're not doing their jobs well, people can see that. I think that's going to be an important part of trust. And the other C, I would say, is candor. So what are you actually doing, what are you knowing, and what are you talking about that, and not sort of sugarcoating it with things that are not true.
Well, I tend to agree with Inji that this three-dimensional approach might probably be the way in which we build trust. I mean, how do we build trust in our vaccination programs? It's not just about scientists, it's also about government, it's about messaging, it's about misinformation, it's about the current network of social media. So it's a multiple stream. So, and how do we use the existing platforms to build trust? But it's also about failures of political systems to deliver. Where governments have failed, sometimes people don't even know that they've got power during elections to change governments. They don't even know that when it's time for elections, they can always go back and choose someone better. So because they'd rather continue and complain, or maybe if there's strong civil society, that may be a vehicle or a mouthpiece that they use. But I think it would require perhaps this approach that you've just described to look at this in a multidimensional manner.
So, Professor Reddy, before I'll hand over back to our chair, but I would request if you had any comments on this, the bold question from the medical student about, you know, corruption and systems and you know, where there's pockets where there aren't reports of corruption, what should we read into that, and then to deliver your any closing thoughts as well.
Well, I suppose there is a fair amount of speculation about the amount of corruption, about the deals that are being done, particularly for high-priced products of technology, which are not universally accessible at affordable rates, or how governments take certain decisions prioritizing certain technical interventions over other technical interventions. They will be there. But unless there is clear-cut evidence gathered, it's going to be difficult to really pinpoint who is to blame. But I believe for this, we need a much more active civil society movement, which is able to investigate, explore, identify the sources. So unless there is an alert civil society, the corruption will get masked. That's the important element, I would say. I really can't answer the specific question that was asked.
So we've got a couple of minutes left, so I would like to hand over to you as chair to kind of share some closing reflections and thank the audience for the engaged participation. A lot of food for thought.
Thank you very much. It's been a very, very rich discussion. I think, let me start by taking up Gitinji's key message that we must evolve a rights and rule-based governance system. And that brought us to the issue of having a system which is agile, accountable, and binding, but where we ought to be really looking at whether there's going to be shared sovereignty or surrendered sovereignty. Countries would not like to completely surrender their sovereignty, but sometimes now, even now, they do, whether they accept it or not, because when large amount of money comes in, their sovereign judgments are sometimes eroded. But how do we actually build that shared sovereignty around a global compact for global good? That's going to be the critical element, and accountability becomes an important element of that particular part. But a point that was made by Soumya is that we are now dealing with many determinants that lie outside the health sector, and we cannot really evade discussion on how best we can collectively influence those determinants for global good. I think Julio Frank talked about the distinction between global governance of health and global governance for health, where we have to really govern all systems which are influencing all of the determinants which impact on health. And climate is an example, food and agriculture systems are an example. There are so many other examples that we can talk about. And that we really need to steer. And since private sector is an important element there, whether in the form of industry or in the form of foundations, I think the discussion between shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism is an important contribution that came from Bruce, but I hope that will be pursued in real earnest. Now, the question, of course, is how is all of this going to happen? And we have talked about all of us being the actors. I think that's what was said. Everyone here and everyone in society is an actor at the community level, at the national level, at the global level. But for all those actors to act in concert, believe that they're in the same boat, and ensure that the boat does not sink, we need trust. And Bruce spelled out that we need competence and candor. May I add conduct as well? People will actually see how you are behaving and whether to trust you or not. And then it needs communication as well, the fourth C. You need to communicate as frequently as possible, as openly as possible, so that people will begin to understand the motives behind each action and will be able to trust each other without necessarily having prejudice or even misunderstanding. So I think conferences like these, which provide a platform for all such actors to come together, are helpful, but this must happen at all levels, from the community to the global level. Thank you. So, Michelle, maybe as the chair, I should thank you for steering the discussion so very well, and thank the panelists for their very erudite, eloquent contributions. Thank you.